The Whistleblower. Ravens circled above Heaven's Way Hospital. It was early spring, and the ravens were preparing to nest in the lattice of poplars lining the grounds. They shrieked and brawled among themselves, trying to seize the best nesting spots between the branches. Their harsh croaking echoed into the hospital wards. Patients, drawing their final breaths, understood that death was near and closed their eyes in submission to fate. Heaven's Way Hospital was a small wretched relic of the Soviet-Russian era, a care facility, or, as it was newly termed, a nursing hospital, essentially a home for the elderly functioning on the state's dime. It also contained a 20-bed follow-up care department. The patients here were mostly elderly people who had reached the twilight of their lives with no hope of recovery, referred to among social workers as burdens of capitalism. These seniors, the weights of society, were on a constant journey. For 2 months, as prescribed by state regulations, they lay in one hospital at the expense of the health insurance fund. Then they were moved to a second and a third before being handed over to relatives who would find them some nursing home, fall into debt, and drag their burden to yet another facility. This shuffling of elderly patients was also practiced by the large central hospitals. After surgery, a senior would spend some time in intensive care, but since recovery was often nowhere in sight, and indeed all signs suggested the patient was soon to embark on a long, interstellar journey, they would be sent to some insignificant local hospital with wretched conditions, where the patient would finish their travels. They departed, as the Indians say, for the happy hunting grounds. The central hospital would mark the patient as discharged alive in its electronic statistics, and the local hospital would also record the patient's departure, albeit as a corpse. Initially, however, the deceased would travel to the mortuary, or the morgue, and then onward. Beside the morgue, a gravelly, potholed road filled with puddles led to a porch under the canopy of the hospital's right wing. This was the hospital entrance. Here visitors entered, and here patients were pushed on stretchers into the vestibule and toward the admitting room. In this room, the intake nurse filled out the necessary documents before the patient was delivered to a ward. Quite a few patients could not wait long enough to get under a warm blanket in a ward. They gave up the ghost beforehand, and the stretcher on wheels was then pushed down a long corridor to the other end of the building, the left wing, out into the yard and toward the morgue. In reality, however, the dead were not pushed to the morgue immediately, and no death certificate was issued. The deceased were kept in a room for the dead for 3 or 4 days. This was done so that even on account of an unreasonably quick departure, the hospital could squeeze at least a few days' worth of daily fees from the health insurance fund. The chief physician of Heaven's Way Hospital, Dr. Mark Markovich, or Moise, as the staff called him, was a notable person in his own right. His appearance was heavy, crude, and he possessed the oily, fawning manner of a usurer. With his face, beard, flat gray hair, and stout, clumsy build, he resembled a well-fed, untamed, coarse tavern keeper from the roadside. His face was stern and covered in tiny blue veins. His eyes were small, his nose red. Though short in stature, he had broad shoulders and enormous hands like an ape's. It seemed that if he struck with a fist, the soul would fly right out. Yet his step was quiet and his gait cautious, almost prowling. When meeting someone in a narrow hospital corridor, he was always the first to stop and give way, saying not in the bass one might expect, but in a thin, soft tenor, "Excuse me." Even his laugh, which he used frequently to appear attractive and a good boss, was always the same, a cold, joyless, rehearsed tenor. His subordinates, 6 or 7 people aged 68 to 79, responded to him in that same rehearsed tenor. Whether out of stinginess or something else, he did not dress as befitted a successful doctor. Only rarely would he be seen in a good blue sweater with a white embroidered label on the chest that read, "Boss." He had worn the same suit for a decade, and the new clothes he usually bought from the Jewish shop looked just as worn and wrinkled on him as the old ones. In the same coat, he received patients, ate lunch, and went visiting, on the rare occasions he went anywhere at all. He had few friends. He socialized mostly with former officials of the district party committee and the KGB, feeling a sense of pride and self-worth in their company.
It was said that in his early youth, Moise had been very devout, meaning he was an exemplary pioneer and Komsomol member. He believed in communism and prepared for a military career. He entered the military medical academy to become a military surgeon. Soon, however, he had to change institutions because he stuttered, and presumably some other psychological disorders were found in his nature. He entered the medical faculty of a regular university, studied well, and after graduation was assigned to a small-town hospital as a surgeon, a so-called day surgeon. He performed small, simple operations, such as lancing abscesses. Abscesses had to be lanced quite frequently because valuable nutrients, so-called vitamins, were rarely seen on shop shelves during the Soviet-Russian era, and people developed boils due to vitamin deficiency. Nutrients like tangerines, bananas, and oranges were found only under the counter and only in special shops for the party nomenclatura. Yes, life was hard, but happy. People were happy when they got something tasty or wearable, like a pair of jeans, from under the counter. The salaries of doctors, like those of all educated people in Soviet times, were small, not to say wretched. To afford even a semblance of a dignified life, Moise took on extra work as a forensic medical examiner, performing autopsies in the morgue. When asked how much he was paid for this grim work, he would answer with black humor, "You dissect 9 corpses, and you get the 10th for yourself." Well, humor aside, Moise earned more from forensic autopsies in the morgue than a top surgeon at a university clinic. Yes, those were the times and the customs. Life demanded to be lived, both for the doctor and his patients. It should be noted that in the autopsy chamber, Moise did not deal with patients, but with objects. A dead person is, after all, no longer a doctor's patient, though one never knows. Even here, one could fiddle a bit and earn extra by recording this or that diagnosis or cause of death as needed. Communist Moise, as mentioned, believed in the victory of world communism, or at least pretended to, and therefore always spoke out fiercely at meetings of the hospital's primary party organization. He thrashed imperialists and money-hungry capitalists, pinning them to the pillar of shame. His co-workers, who were not as devout or orthodox as he, also got their share of his tongue. Moise's performances were crowned with success. He was elected secretary of the primary party organization, the hospital's partorg. Such a position, in addition to his main work, provided certain privileges: the allocation of a larger apartment, permission to buy a car, and an excursion to a fraternal socialist country like Hungary or Czechoslovakia. Soon, the district party committee noticed his active faith, and he was promoted to chief physician of the town's hospital. When Mark Mitch took the chair of the chief physician at the age of 29, largely with the help of the district party committee and the KGB, the hospital was in a horrific state. It was hard to breathe in the wards, corridors, and the yard because of the stench. Hospital workers, orderlies, and their children slept in the wards alongside the sick. The hospital corridors were lined against both walls with folding cots where patients groaned, wheezed, and coughed. The morgue was overfilled, unable to meet demand. The patients and those lying in the morgue did not file complaints about the hospital's condition, but the staff sleeping in the wards, along with their wives and children, complained that cockroaches, bedbugs, and mice would not let them live. Erysipelas flourished in the surgical department. For the entire hospital, there were only 2 scalpels, and those were dull. The only thermometer had been stolen by someone, and in the tubs of the operating block, severed limbs were kept.
It was also known that the orderlies and paramedics robbed the sick and brought them vodka from the shop, taking one of the 2 bottles for themselves. But the former chief physician, Dr. Boyko, was a man of perverted tendencies. He organized a whole harem for himself out of the nurses and patients and, in addition, sold the hospital's alcohol. Everyone had known this for a long time, including the party and the KGB, but since it was felt that all those unfortunate, ordinary people would live even worse at home, things were allowed to proceed as they were. Finally, as noted before, Moise coveted this lucrative position, and the district party committee and KGB threw their weight behind him. Some shortcomings were found in the work of the sitting chief physician, the internist, Dr. Boyko, and he was reassigned to the position of duty doctor in the ER, the emergency medicine department. This was his true place. Although the ER was supposed to work around the clock, Dr. Boyko would lock the outer door well before sunset, turn out the lights, and go to sleep with a nurse. Those in need prowled around the hospital at night, knocking on doors and windows, but the earth would sooner stop spinning, or a common criminal would sooner break into a prison in the middle of the night than a person would get into that ER.
Mark Markovich, as said, received his promotion. He inspected the hospital, now with the stern eye of a chief physician, and decided that some significant reorganizations were necessary, as the general state of the hospital was contrary to morality and extremely harmful, even dangerous, to the patient's health. In his opinion, the wisest thing to do would have been to send the patients away and close the hospital. However, he realized clearly that by doing so, he would lose all respect at the district party committee. He would no longer be able to treat the naughty diseases of the KGB comrades, and in general, he would be a nobody. Besides, selling alcohol was a profitable business that needed to be increased and expanded. After all, one can make very sweet and strong liqueurs and nalivkas from spirit. And what was the use of closing such a hospital? If you chase physical and moral filth away from one place, it simply goes to another. Furthermore, if people have opened a hospital and tolerate it in their midst, and the state funds it, then it means it is necessary to them. Prejudices and all these vilenesses and swineries of life are indispensable to the ordinary person, because over time they transform into something reasonable, just as manure turns into black soil. Having taken over the post, Moise did not set about conducting a perestroika, that is, radical reforms to dismantle the hospital's structures. First of all, he increased the chief physician's salary, his own, several times over, and acquired a Zhiguli Lux as his official car. A self-satisfied Moise sat in the warm seat of the chief physician. Money flowed smoothly from the state budget every month, enough for the hospital's operating costs and staff salaries, and most importantly, the material base of his own family could be significantly improved, undoubtedly with budget funds. Years passed in their own way. The young chief physician had become a 68-year-old gray-haired man, but still, he sat in the chief physician's chair and spoke actively at meetings of the hospital's primary party organization. And then came perestroika, glasnost, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and privatization, or grabitization. The old ideologically driven communist Moise and the equally old hospital party secretary knew exactly what to do. The hospital had to be pulled into private hands. As it was decided, so it was done. After privatizing the hospital, Moise first acquired the latest model BMW SUV and hired his entire kin. He also put his thug-brute sons on the payroll, 28, 32, and 34 years old, who had never worked a day in their lives. He used hospital funds to buy them all 8-cylinder Dodge SUVs and Belgian sniper rifles with optical sights, in addition to pump-action shotguns and pistols, for his beloved sons were fierce hunters. He also changed the phone company, Now, every family member, through a so-called family package, could talk for free on mobile phones as much as they liked, even though the package cost the hospital a pretty penny. He also imposed rent on the hospital workers, the orderlies, paramedics, and their children, who had lived for free in the hospital wards since Soviet-Russian times. Now, after privatization, they became forced tenants. To maintain order and authority, Mark Markovich liked to hold every morning a management meeting, or thug minutes, petiminutkad, as the staff called them. These meetings were attended by 6 or 7 subordinates, the so-called top officials. These were his longtime comrades in arms from the blessed Soviet-Russian times. 78-year-old asthmatic operations manager Nikolai, who worked a quarter-time position but had to manage the entire infrastructure, from responsibility for water and sewage to fire safety and electricity, cleaning toilet bowls and sinks, and changing fuses and light bulbs. Although the operations manager understood that in the event of a fire, handcuffs and bars were guaranteed for him, as nothing in the hospital met safety standards, he nevertheless agreed to work for the 175 euros Moise offered. It was, after all, a hefty addition to an extremely measly state pension. Beside him sat a 69-year-old woman, the economic manager, who looked after the patient's food. She and Moise had certain agreements regarding food supplies. They procured fictitious invoices and fiddled in other ways, but only the two of them knew this. Quite a few of the deceased who had already gone to their earthly food remained on the hospital's food list as living beings, continuing as non-eaters to collect daily fees from the health insurance fund, earning Moise easy money. Although patients in the nursing and follow-up care departments were practically not treated and no medicine was spent on them, the head nurse, fearing inspections from the health board and the health insurance fund, watched very carefully that the medical records for every patient were filled out properly. For this purpose, a young, imaginative nurse had been hired who sat for hours every day at a desk, filling out patient records in the required form and manner without ever having seen the patients in the flesh. The hospital's chief accountant, a 72-year-old woman, did not open her mouth much at meetings, only noting laconically, "There is no money. We are having trouble paying salaries and taxes." The head nurse sat at the chief physician's right hand, for she alone possessed all the information and therefore mostly remained silent at meetings, only smirking ironically. But sometimes she couldn't help herself and snapped. "The orderlies and nurses are working overtime, on duty day and night, but are still paid only at the standard rate with no days off. The number of orderlies and nurses on the payroll is only a little over half of what is required by regulations. The operating license for the follow-up care department expired a year and a half ago. We are criminally providing healthcare services without a license. Damn it, I'll tell you all to go to hell and leave for Finland." But there had been so many of these go-to-hells that no one took her seriously. Moise no longer even noticed the head nurse's emotional outbursts. He only mulled over thoughts known only to himself. "Increasing staff won't increase the daily fee from the fund, so how are we to live? Profit, owner's income must come from somewhere, otherwise why bother with private enterprise? And follow-up care. To renew the license, we need to upgrade equipment, machinery, and send staff to paid continuing education. Where to get the money for all that? And those 2 or 3 follow-up care doctors aged 75 plus, even they can only say in the state language, mouth open, mouth shut. Breathe, don't breathe." During the thug minutes, Moise, being not only a former Soviet-era chief physician but also a former primary party organization secretary, could let off steam and conduct political training. He always had a newspaper article ready about some politician or a critique of the government. Waving the newspaper with an emotional, ironic face, he expressed his critical views and resolutely stated his opinion, finding that the ministers in the government were fools and profanes, and the parliament was a pack of idiots. Through his political upbringing,
Moise signaled to his subordinates that minimum wages, unpaid overtime, layoffs, and forcing people to work full-time for half pay all stemmed from the government's policy, which was supposedly robbing his private hospital blind. The health insurance fund was a particularly frequent target of his morning criticism for maliciously failing to allocate enough money to his private hospital.
After spending 10 minutes on political work befitting a former communist, Moise turned to practicing mental terrorism on his subordinates. He mocked one worker or another, showed off his superior status, and demeaned and insulted his staff, knowing that their pensions were small and they were forced to swallow the insults in silence and work for the few shekels Moise dropped their way. Incidentally, Moise, feeling a vague nostalgia for the Soviet Union and the party, referred to currency only as rubles, even though he was talking about euros. Moise would say, "The price of diapers has risen, so we must reduce the daily diaper allowance for nursing by 2 rubles. Everyone at the meeting nodded in agreement and understanding. He wasn't talking about rubles or shekels, but about euros. Moise often improvised during his thug minutes, presenting himself alternately as a stern, demanding boss and as a mild, benevolent one. In the role of the mild boss, he tossed around witticisms. However, his jokes were always insulting and coarse. In the role of the stern boss, he threatened to fine, fire, or give the boot to workers, always emphasizing, "My hospital is a private enterprise and no laws concern me. I have never followed laws more than 25%. Then he would lower his tone like an actor on stage. "I love intelligence and honesty very much." Words were just words, but he lacked the character to organize an honest and intelligent life around himself, nor could he curb his greed. The participants of the meeting filed out of the chief physician's office, muttering to themselves, "Mad Napoleon, autocrat." Moise, so resolute in his morning meetings, like a partorg at a party meeting, was generally a hesitant, insecure, and fearful man. Even when he came to the hospital kitchen to fill his belly with the hospital slop, he did not use the imperative. It was hard for him to say give or bring, perhaps because it felt like begging. Instead of asking for food, he would cough and look at the kitchen girl like a dog. If patients complained of hunger or crude orderlies, he felt embarrassed and muttered guiltily, all right, I'll look into it later. There must be a misunderstanding here." Generally, in everything concerning the hospital's life and existence, his primary reaction was to postpone a decision, noting wisely, "One cannot act headlong in hospital management. One must think, weigh things, not rush." He would give a task to everyone, and no one in particular. "Everyone needs to think about this matter." But in matters concerning himself or his family, buying a new official car repairs at the hospital's expense, changing tires, new phones, etc., he was resolute. "The decision has been made. I am the chief physician and I decide. I will not grant anyone the floor on this matter." The chief accountant smirked and curled her lips disdainfully. Again, salary payments would have to be delayed or paid in 2 installments. But she dared not say anything. After all, she was a woman of pensionable age, and her pension was small. At one of the thug minutes, Nikolai, the operations manager, finally decided to open his mouth. "The 50-meter iron water pipe from the main to the hospital is 50 years old. It could burst at any moment and it can't be patched. Replacing the pipe in winter will take a long time and the hospital will be without water for days." The chief physician's face turned red and took on a threatening expression, but the operations manager continued regardless. "In addition, the fire department issued a directive. Fire-resistant partition doors must be installed, about 30 doors, and we must acquire 100 special mattresses slings for evacuating bedbound patients. These things must be done
if we don't want a criminal case on our hands, because in the event of a fire, we won't be able to carry bedbound patients out from the second and third floors in time. They'll burn up inside."
The chief physician barked angrily. "Did I give you the floor? Speak when you are asked."
Nikolai shrugged and fell silent. The hospital manager and owner thought to himself, "An old man gone mad with his water pipe, fire-resistant doors, and slings. The only income of my private hospital is the money from the health insurance fund, the so-called bed day fees according to the tariffs. But I, the owner, and my family also want to eat and live. From what money? From those same bed day funds. I need to buy a new SUV. My friends go hunting in brand new SUVs, while I, the owner and chief physician of a hospital, still have the same 10-year-old clunker. And my younger son, he wants to buy an apartment in a row house by the sea. The brat barely earns €1,000 a month. What money to buy it with? From those same health fund tariffs, the patient's bed day money. But this old fool, Nikolai, he wants to change a pipe and install fire-resistant partitions in those idiotic sling mattresses. Who is going to sling them in a fire when the night shift for 2 floors consists of 1 elderly orderly and 1 pensioner nurse? Besides, the head nurse is harping on about paying the orderlies and nurses for overtime according to the law at 1.5 times the rate. Everyone's gone mad. Where the hell am I supposed to get that money? Tell me." The hospital owner did not speak of spending figures or accounts. He did not reveal accounting secrets. Instead, he always posed the same question to the management. "Where am I supposed to get more money? Tell me." The entire elderly management of the hospital lived in a kind of vicious circle. They understood that the hospital owner and chief physician was a poor, characterless leader who stole, cheated, and paid pittance wages, but they dared not speak up. Even a couple of €100 was a significant addition to a wretched pension. One morning, Nikolai was tasked by Moise to go and get a statement from Dr. Boyko, the ER duty doctor. He had again slept through the night with a nurse, while those in need prowled around the house, banging on doors and windows, without receiving help. In truth, the statement was just a formality. The point was that the health fund no longer funded this practically non-existent ER, and Dr. Boyko and his nurse needed to be laid off. There was no money for severance, and no desire to pay out 3 or 4 months' worth of redundancy benefits. It was simpler and cheaper to fire Boyko and his nurse for a breach of work discipline. Nikolai knocked on the ER admitting room door. This time it was unlocked, and he stepped in. On the bed against the right wall sat Dr. Boyko. He was wearing a white undershirt and long white underpants. Bare feet hung down from the edge of the bed. Though it was already 9 o'clock, the bed was not yet made. In the bed against the other wall lay a figure who had pulled the blanket up to their eyes and was peeking out from under the edge at the manager. Presumably, this was the ER nurse. After a brief greeting, Nikolai explained the reason for his visit. "A statement is needed regarding last night." He placed a clean sheet of paper and a pen on the table. Dr. Boyko cleared a bra and panties from the chair by the bed and said politely, "Please, have a seat." Then he asked, "Do you want a statement about how I had sex with the nurse last night?" Nikolai shrugged. "Sex interests me very little in this situation, but the boss, the chief physician, wants to know why the ER door was locked and the rooms dark when there is supposed to be a 24-hour intake."
"Ah, the chief physician. What kind of damn chief physician? A common thief and corrupt official who grabbed the hospital for pennies,"
Dr. Boyko said angrily. Then he began a long, overflowing speech that rushed out like water from a burst dam. "There's no money for wages. But how much of the health fund money goes to off-hospital expenses? Repairs for the cars of the chief physician and his sons, tire changes, hunting trips through the woods, gasoline, phone bills, trips to Pskov, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Ukraine, Finland, Germany, Paris. Everything needed for the household, even knives and forks, salt and shit, is bought on the hospital account with health fund money, but for themselves. Damn it, only now, after the grabatization, did this former communist get himself true communism. Everything is free. Meanwhile, constant layoffs, giving people the boot, putting workers on half load or quarter load just to pay half or a quarter of the state-mandated minimum wage, even though the people do a full job, plus overtime, which is still paid at the regular rate. Moise's wife and some shady doctor are performing underground cosmetic surgeries in the operating block, which is officially out of use and closed. Essentially, it's a criminal offense, but money doesn't stink.
Moise acts for the sake of his loved ones, Nikolai said, just to say something.
The duty doctor suddenly changed the subject. Well, before humans, everything living on Earth demanded only one thing: give. The instinct to reproduce was identical with the brutal instinct to possess. There was no question of anyone, even the most developed animals, having a need to set something aside for their species, their offspring. The nurse said from under the blanket, "Nowadays it's not about reproduction, but about love." As she said this, she stuck her bare foot out from under the blanket and wiggled her toes, as if inviting the operations manager into the bed. A sharp cough from the doctor forced the foot back under the blanket. Having chased the nurse's foot back, the doctor continued his musings. Actually, Lenin said that two participate in love, and a third arises, a new life. Social interest is embedded here. A duty to society is born. The nurse under the blanket snorted with laughter. Two participate in love, and a third arises. Let me laugh. 4 or 5 or more can participate in love, and if you use condoms or pills, nothing arises. Lenin was just a thoroughly primitive old man. Dr. Boyko, forgetting Nikolai's presence, began to argue with his nurse. Lenin said that communism must bring with it not asceticism, but joy of life and vigor, one of the triggers of which is a perfect love life. This means that social-type forces are hidden within it, and they are immense. The nurse said triumphantly from under the blanket, "I've always said that passionate sex is healthy. It's the second law of thermodynamics." Nikolai cleared his throat to remind the two lovers of his presence. Dr. Boyko immediately returned to his previous frequency. "My nurse and I are on duty 60 hours a week, but the legally mandated overtime rate isn't paid. Damn it, I'm going to the labor inspectorate to complain. And if things keep going this way, the chief physician himself will have to start turning over bed-bound patients with bed sores and changing their diapers, or the hospital will start to stink across the whole town." The nurse supported her boss from under the blanket. "Moise pretends to pay the nurses, and we pretend to work." Nikolai took the pen and the clean sheet of paper from the table and left without a word. Life was perhaps nowhere as monotonous as in this hospital. In the morning, the patients, except those bedbound, washed themselves in a large room with a row of a dozen sinks. Then they drank tea. 1 mugful was allocated to each. At midday, they ate sauerkraut soup and porridge, and in the evening, they ate the porridge left over from lunch. The hospital owner, Chief Physician Moise, observed strict economy in handling the health fund money. In addition to the patients, other expenses had to be covered from those funds. The gasoline for the son's cars was consumed so ravenously, it was as if they ran a motor depot rather than a hospital. The boys roamed through the woods in their Dodge SUVs, trashed the cars and tires, burned fuel like mad, and then there were their constant trips to Russia and Ukraine to visit distant relatives and elsewhere across all of Europe. Health fund money was always in short supply. Moise entered the chief accountant's office several times a day to find out if the health fund had transferred the next package of funds. He had actually tired out the elderly chief accountant with his inquiries, always asking 2 questions. "Have you seen my wife? Did the health fund send the money?" Moisei had an eternal trouble with his wife and his money. His wife was constantly missing somewhere. Money was constantly scarce. Salary payments were delayed and had to be paid in several parts. The fuel company demanded immediate transfer because the limit was reached. The boys had exhausted the fuel limit for their cars. The fuel company threatened to turn off the fuel taps if the money was not received immediately. The leasing company bombarded him with emails. The deadline for the lease payments for the SUVs bought in the hospital's name had passed. In addition, trouble arose with the health insurance fund and the health board. The health board sent emails stating that the follow-up care license was invalid and must be renewed if they wished to continue with healthcare services. The letters were quite mild, not pushing too hard. But things were several times worse with the health insurance fund. Some curator there kept calling and calling. "You have no license for follow-up care. If this isn't settled, we will stop financing the follow-up care service." They just kept calling. Finally, the hospital secretary lost her temper and said into the receiver in a resolute voice, "I don't understand what you want. If you have problems, send an email." No email was sent, and eventually the matter died down entirely. Even the fire inspector stopped calling with demands to install fire-resistant doors. Everyone had gone quiet. Things had smoothed over, as if by themselves. Yet these things do not happen quite so simply. A week ago, Moisei, the owner and chief physician of Heaven's Way Hospital, had started to move. This time, Moisei rose earlier than usual and, to his wife's surprise, demanded a new shirt, though he usually changed his shirt only once a week. But today was only Wednesday. Moisei dressed slowly, with a serious face. With equal seriousness and deep in thought, he ate his morning porridge and then grabbed his bulky briefcase. He fumbled by the wall unit and placed 3 bottles of Hennessy cognac and 3 boxes of chocolates into his briefcase, which was already bulging with counterfeit medicine. He thought for a moment and pulled open a desk drawer. His hands rummaged hesitantly, but finally he reached a decision. He stacked 3 piles of 100-euro bills on the table, 20 bills in each pile. He slipped the money into 3 envelopes, licked the edges, and sealed them. He placed the envelopes with the chocolate boxes and closed the briefcase with a determined click. Today he had meetings with the regional curator of the health insurance fund, an official from the health board's oversight department, and a fire safety inspector. It was necessary to negotiate follow-up care issues and funding contracts and to bargain with the fire inspector regarding the fire-resistant doors. The health fund's reduction or termination of treatment case orders and the resulting drying up of cash flow was a matter of life and death for Moisei's private hospital. The regional curator of the health insurance fund, a middle-aged, portly man with a serious, hard-working official's face and an impenetrable gaze, accepted the bottle of cognac without a word or thanks, as if this procedure were a part of daily duties for both the giver and the receiver. Having cast a brief glance at the label of the cognac bottle in passing, the curator placed the bottles behind the leg of the desk. He then settled himself comfortably in the armchair and began a lecture. Although the listener was only one person, Moisei, the chief physician of a small and insignificant local hospital, the curator spoke with obvious pleasure, as if addressing an audience full of listeners. Until now, it has not been stated clearly, but indirectly the state has already directed smaller county hospitals to change their profiles. For your hospital, since you have lost the status of a local hospital, the operating license will no longer be extended because your hospital does not meet that status. You have shrunk too much. There is no ER, no rehabilitation, no laboratory, no X-ray, and no specialist doctors. Furthermore, you are a private hospital, a joint stock company. The development plan for the hospital network does not provide for your existence, which means the health insurance fund will no longer enter into a follow-up care contract with your hospital. Well, yes, but the number of nursing care beds given to us remains insufficient. It doesn't even cover the costs of keeping the kitchen. And what nursing care? They're all seniors. They lie there for a week and then they go to the next world. Moise waved his hand in frustration. The health fund curator looked at Moise with an ironic gaze and said, "Rumors have reached us that you are using the health fund money improperly." Moise felt a chill in his chest. What does improperly mean? It means that a large part of the money allocated by the health fund goes to off-hospital expenses. At the same time, healthcare is one of the largest, almost the only budget lines where taxpayer money goes back into private pockets via the health fund, to private hospitals and family doctors limited companies. We should be monitoring the spending of the money allocated by the fund in these private structures, but so far the government has not seen it necessary to create financial control and audit units within the fund. A private hospital is one thing, but if it receives money from the fund, a representative of the fund should sit on the board of that private hospital to monitor how the money is spent. But now, it's just some formal, largely fictitious reports on money use. Of course, if an anonymous signal reaches the police or the prosecutor, that's another matter. But they still get their information from us. Moise realized he was dealing with a much larger player here. A bottle of Hennessy alone would not be enough. But he tried weakly to defend himself. Well, yes, but somehow, through the redistribution of money and income, the state must create a broad and loyal middle class for itself. The regional curator of the health fund remained silent. Moise secretly took the pre-prepared envelope of cash from his briefcase and slid it under the papers lying on the curator's desk. The latter made a face as if he noticed nothing. Moise stepped out of the regional curator's office. On the outer stairs he stopped and breathed in long and deep several times to get his heart back into a calm rhythm. At the health board, there was less talk. The worker in the oversight department was in a hurry. A meeting with the Director General lay ahead. He accepted the bottle of cognac, cast a quick glance at the envelope placed on the corner of the desk, and having heard Moise's plea, said, "Fine, although your hospital does not meet the requirements. There are no proper conditions for follow-up care and no competent doctors. Operate until the end of the health fund contract." He paused and added, "Anyway, the contingent that the central hospital sent to you doesn't even need treatment anymore. Follow-up care, my foot." With the local fire inspector, things went very simply. He was a former safety engineer of a grabatized sovkhoz, though with a secondary vocational education, still an engineer. Now he worked in fire safety. The inspector accepted the gifts without further talk and taught him, "Still, move yourself a bit. Order at least a project for the installation of fire-resistant partition doors. Well, you could also acquire Ka, or 3 evacuation mattress slings to show to the inspectors." After the stressful visits to official institutions, Moise was completely tired and jaded. Officials always have their hands out. Just give, give. Without an offering, no one will even talk to you. Driving toward home, he imagined the attentive, worried face with which his wife Manya would be waiting for him, surely restless and on guard. Moise repeated to himself, "The main thing is that I don't let others suffer. It's enough that I suffer myself. The main thing is that I don't let Manya suffer." Manya was 20 years younger than her husband and a woman of quite a blooming appearance, a constant object and subject of Moise's jealousy. Nevertheless, at home, Moise felt like a continuous object of investigation. "He worries me," the doctor's wife told her mother-in-law. "You are a lucky person to be able to watch this calmly. I envy people with a different character. Mark is a bit exhausted. He works too much. That is visible. But he actually has iron health. That reassures me." "Clear proof that he considers himself sick," Manya said to the mother-in-law. "Yesterday I caught him in front of the mirror. Until now he has never cared about his appearance, but now he studied his face quite closely, touched it with a finger. It seemed as if he wanted to smooth out wrinkles from his forehead and temples. He even opened his mouth and studied his teeth, poked his ears with a finger.
The old woman muttered to herself,
He is not sick, but something is truly wrong with him.
Mrs. Markovich repeated.
Doctors themselves care the least about their own health.
Moisei took a seat at the dinner table. The whole family had gathered for the evening meal. 3 sons with their wives, 5 grandchildren of various ages, and the mother-in-law. At the dining table, Manya watched her husband.
You look even worse tonight. What are you waiting for? Why don't you go to Dr. Smith? If you don't do it for yourself, think at least of us. The question is not just about you, it concerns us all.
The sons and daughters-in-law sitting at the table nodded in agreement. In reality, they were the doctor's dependents. All 3 sons were on the hospital's staff list, one as an economist, another as a senior accountant or a consultant. They received a salary but did no work. Occasionally, they appeared walking through the house with important faces. After all, they were the sons of the chief physician, and then vanished. The sons' wives did not work anywhere. They occupied themselves mostly with their own appearance. Now one of them said warmly, Of course, Father, we all want you to be around for as kawa as possible.
Manya supported her daughter-in-law. Yes, of course, Father. You must treat yourself for the sake of your children.
The doctor answered her with a grimace. Today is Wednesday. Why a cutlet then?
You need a richer diet. What do you know about that?
Why won't you go to Dr. Smith for an examination? A doctor cannot treat himself.
Why do you think, dear Manya, that I am sick? You don't see yourself, but your face is frightening. Everyone notices it. I don't remember who it was who asked only yesterday, What is wrong with your husband? You should take some choline. I am sure it's the liver. Why specifically the liver and not some other organ? I simply have that impression, the woman declared categorically.
Manya had a firm feeling that it was the liver, and nothing could shake her opinion. She tormented her husband with exhortations that were more annoying than flies.
You already drank 2 cups of coffee, and I'll tell the kitchen not to bring any more. That was your 3rd cigarette already. Don't argue. Look, there are 3 stubs in the ashtray.
The woman believed only in physical illness, and when the husband drew his hands over his tormented face, she repeated,
It is the common opinion of all of us. You must consult Dr. Smith. Smith won't tell me anything I don't know myself. Can you listen to your own heart?
The doctor did not answer, closely monitoring the oppressive pressure in his heart, as if someone held it in their palm and was gently squeezing. Oh, of course, he could read its beats more accurately than a stranger could.
Perhaps it's no longer necessary to fleece the hospital so much. We could get by with less,
the youngest son said, wishing to show goodwill.
Ah, fleece, fleece, you brat dare to teach me how to live.
Brat? Repeat that. Both father and son jumped up. Manya shouted to her husband.
Don't answer him. It's not worth the trouble. What he says has no weight. An empty braggart.
The doctor asked his son to sit.
Sit and eat, and let this be the end of it.
The son took a seat, stirred the soup in his plate with a spoon, and muttered to himself,
Brat. I'll show you who is a brat.
Then everyone took their seats again. A secret alliance forced them all to extinguish the fire with joint efforts. The family spirit made everything that threatened their internal balance deeply repugnant to them. The instinct of self-preservation made the crew sentenced for life to the same galley, vigilant toward the slightest danger of fire on board. Silence fell in the dining room. The light rain that had rustled on the terrace steps suddenly stopped, and the aroma it had raised floated around the silent family. Someone said hastily,
It has already turned cooler.
To this, another voice replied that such a rain is of no help. It doesn't keep the dust down. When the sons and daughters-in-law had left the table and gone to their rooms, the doctor told his wife about his visit to the health fund curator and the hospital's economic problems.
Manya,
Since the health fund will no longer finance our follow-up care and specialist doctors won't order medical services and will reduce nursing care orders, it means bankruptcy for the hospital. It is possible that I, as the hospital manager, will have to bear responsibility.
A long silence followed. Then Manya asked,
Does this house belong to the joint property of the spouses?
Moisei began to act, reducing the hospital's running costs. The only possibility was to reduce staff and save on the wage fund. Nikolai, the operations manager, was the first to be hit.
You're already old and weak. You don't understand anything anymore. Starting tomorrow, don't come to work, Moisei told his longtime colleague, meeting him in a ward where he was just cleaning a toilet bowl.
Nikolai threw the toilet plunger on the floor and left without a word.
Yet his soul ached, his heart pounded. The proposal to leave had been made in an extremely crude manner. It was done as Moisei was accustomed to treating his colleagues during the morning thug minutes. Yes, Moisei did not know how to talk to people. He only commanded, scolded, and mocked. He had dissected hundreds of corpses, but he had not learned to know the anatomy of the human soul through his dissections.
Nikolai was extremely insulted by Moisei's words. After all, he had always been ready to come to the rescue, to fix taps, to clean clogged sinks and toilet bowls, to change fuses and light bulbs, to record electricity and water meter readings. He had been an exemplary operations manager. He always appeared at the first phone call, day or night, Saturday or Sunday, and on public holidays, even though his workload in the contract was 0.25 and he received the corresponding part of the minimum wage. And now, you are old, weak, and a fool. Nikolai sat down at his old computer, which still functioned as a typewriter and could send emails and receive internet signals. He decided to become a whistleblower. He wrote his first letter to the Labor Inspectorate.
Honored Labor Inspectorate.
At Heaven's Way Hospital, orderlies and nurses work according to schedules and double schedules, fictitious schedules, with a load of 200, 250, even 300 hours a month. Yet overtime is paid at a rate of 1.0 and no days off are given. This is a gross violation of the law and slave labor. Please intervene and set things right.
With respect, former operations manager of Heaven's Way Hospital. Only a couple of days passed, and the former manager received an electronic reply from the Labor Inspectorate. Official document, classified for 75 years.
Dear former operations manager of Heaven's Way Hospital,
in your appeal, you point out that people work according to schedules and double schedules at Heaven's Way Hospital. Please clarify which specific positions these employees occupy. In your appeal, you point out that people work 200 to 300 hours a month. Please provide more concrete examples of the organization of the employees' working hours, that is, how long the workdays are in hours for employees in those positions, how many days they work, and how many days they rest afterward, whether the employees are guaranteed daily and weekly rest periods, etc. Please clarify which working time calculation period applies to the employees, 1, 2, 3, or 4 months. How is overtime work performed by the employees, and what specifically is the agreement concluded with the employees for the compensation of overtime work? I hope my letter was of help to you. With respect, Labor Inspector of the Oversight Department, Master of Laws.
Receiving such a response to his whistle, the former operations manager scratched the back of his neck but decided to press the button on the computer anyway and provide a quick electronic reply.
Honored Labor Inspector, Master of Laws. Your questionnaire is entirely appropriate, though not exhaustive. I am the former operations manager of Heaven's Way Hospital and currently have no access to the information. However, through my former connections, I could perhaps provide answers to all your questions and even more. But in that case, I ask you to transfer your 1 month's salary to my account. With respect, former operations manager of Heaven's Way Hospital.
Having stepped into it with his first whistleblowing attempt, the former operations manager did not back down. After all, He had been the chairman of the hospital's trade union committee during the Soviet-Russian era. The next whistle went out, and this time to the health insurance fund.
Honored Health Insurance Fund.
I am the former operations manager of Heaven's Way Hospital. I want to let you know that Heaven's Way Hospital is earning easy money. Death certificates are not issued immediately for deceased individuals, but they are kept for 3 or 4 days in a so-called room for the dead before being sent to the morgue. And for this hovering time, legally speaking, our hospital manager Moise bills the fund according to daily tariffs. I ask for this nonsense to be stopped because money is needed elsewhere as well.
With respect, former operations manager of Heaven's Way Hospital.
Only a few days passed, and the fund's communication manager replied, very wisely and scientifically.
Official document, classified for 75 years.
Most honored former operations manager of Heaven's Way Hospital, we thank you for the tip. Contact with the general public is very important to us. As for your specific observations, doctors of medical sciences and academics have reached an interesting conclusion. A person's soul hovers around its earthly body for at least 4 days. It is not sensible or expedient to send a deceased patient immediately to the morgue, as access for their soul there is presumably difficult or even blocked. Furthermore, I emphasize that it is known from Eastern mythology that a person is sometimes buried alive without identifying that they are still breathing quietly or their heart is beating slowly. Therefore, and taking into account that your hospital has almost no qualified doctors, it is sensible and expedient to leave the deceased in the room for the dead for 3 to 4 days until they turn cold. Undoubtedly, the health insurance fund pays the medical bills according to the day the death certificate is issued, where half a day is counted as a full day.
With respect,
Communication manager of the health insurance fund, master of philology. Nikolai fell into a deep depression, another whistle, gone to heaven. But he did not give up. He kept clicking the computer keys. A new whistle went to the health board, this time directly to the Director General. Honored Director General, allow me, a small and weak person, the former operations manager of Heaven's Way Hospital, to approach you with a humble request. Stop the illegal, criminal medical business at Heaven's Way Hospital. The said hospital has been operating without a license for more than 1.5 years, conducting some follow-up care business, while the health insurance fund foots all the bills. If some state official has the right to decide on the compliance with laws, including criminal laws, what then is the purpose of the Constitution, the laws, the courts, the prosecution and the police? With sincere respect, former operations manager of Heaven's Way Hospital. For almost a week, Nikolai's computer remained silent. There was not a peep from the health board. But then came the reply. Official document, classified for 75 years. Mr. Former Operations Manager, we inform you that Heaven's Way Hospital does not provide healthcare services in the traditional sense of the term. Said hospital is a waypoint in directing the contingent from central hospitals to the morgue. This involves logistical services, or, in medical terms, follow-up care services. No operating license is required for such actions, and no license is issued. With respect, Assistant to the Director General, Master of Logistics. Nikolai sat indignant and defeated before his computer. All his effort in the search for law and justice had gone down the drain. What to do? Should he just give up? He decided to write to the prosecutor's office, the stronghold of state law. He described the entire situation at Heaven's Way Hospital in great detail, attached his letters to the Labor Inspectorate, the Health Insurance Fund, and the Health Board, and the replies received from them. He also noted that the fire department had issued a directive years ago requiring the construction of fire-resistant partition doors and the installation of evacuation mattress slings. The directive remains unfulfilled. In the event of a fire, patients will burn up because there is only one elderly orderly and a pensioner nurse on the night shift, and no one can carry the bed-bound patients out in time. Please help with the force of the law. These are people, after all. Nikolai wrote at the end of his cry for help. The prosecutor, or rather the assistant prosecutor, sat bored at his desk. He had experienced school bullying because of his small stature and, driven by this, had entered the police academy after high school. But even there, he remained the same unremarkable figure. And after graduation, no one wanted him as a partner. What can this fly do with a burly thug? Finally, the young man gave up on his dream of becoming a famous detective policeman and settled into the prosecutor's office. He began churning out indictments for shoplifters, hooligans, and other small fry. He also handled whistleblowers' complaints, inventing answers to their nonsense. The prosecutor sat in his office at the computer. Kukuku FM radio played quiet music and folk songs. The office was warm and cozy. The prosecutor drained his mug of coffee and began drafting a response to the whistleblower. Does that fool former operations manager of Heaven's Way Hospital really have the stomach to keep messing around? Just let it be for once, he thought with disdain. Official document, classified for 75 years. Most honored former operations manager of Heaven's Way Hospital. The circumstances presented in your letter were not confirmed. Employees of Heaven's Way Hospital are paid for overtime according to the requirements of the law. Those who have grievances should approach the court or the labor inspectorate. The Health Insurance Fund monitors the compliance of the staff numbers. I suggest you approach the fund. It appears from the Health Board's explanations that Heaven's Way Hospital is not a classical hospital in the literal sense of the word, but a logistical waypoint before sending a body to the morgue, or, in medical terminology, follow-up care, for which a license is not required. As for the failure to comply with the fire department's requirement to install fire-resistant doors and acquire evacuation mattresses, it appears from the fire department's information that the matter is being addressed and will be resolved according to the action plan in logical order. We thank you for the tip. We are grateful for your further cooperation with the prosecutor's office. Assistant Prosecutor, Master of Laws. The prosecutor read the reply once more, smirked with self-satisfaction, and pressed the send button. The computer immediately informed him, "Your letter has been sent." The prosecutor snorted, flattered by the computer's quick response, rose from behind the desk, took his mug, and stepped into the corridor. From the coffee machine that bubbled at state expense in the corridor throughout the workday, he drew another mug of strong coffee and returned to his office. He sank back into the armchair with a comfortable sigh, crossed his legs, sipped his coffee, and thought contentedly, life in the prosecutor's office is better after all than chasing thugs on the street. Quiet music played from Kukuku FM radio. Suddenly the music stopped and the announcer said, "We convey a report of a fire. Last night, Heaven's Way Hospital burned to the ground. Firefighters managed to carry 26 bedbound patients out of the building. 16 of them burned inside. 10 died of carbon monoxide poisoning, and 12 patients in critical condition were taken by ambulance to the central hospital." The radio went silent, as if the announcer were waiting for something more, or was in phone contact with someone. Soon the radio came back to life. "We convey a heartening message from Heaven's Way Hospital. Of those 10 patients who died of carbon monoxide poisoning, 4 were actually in the so-called room for the dead, awaiting transfer to the morgue. They had died already 4 days ago." Thank you for listening. To discover more stories, follow the link in the description below.